Hello barbecue family, I'm Steve Gao and this video is very special because we're covering all of the mistakes you can make with smoking a brisket and how to avoid them. We're gonna cover mistakes from selecting a brisket all the way to slicing it and serving it and everything in between. And trust me guys, I've made all of these mistakes so you can learn from my failures and you can make an amazing brisket. Your family will love you, your friends will love you, heck, strangers will love you. After watching this video, you're gonna know so much about brisket. Your family is gonna be asking over and over again, what is your secret? There's gonna be smiles across the table, reaching for seconds, because that's what it's all about, guys. So sit back and relax. We've got a lot to cover because here at Smoke Trails Barbecue, we're all about breaking it down step by step, making things simple so you can elevate your barbecue game and become a barbecue legend at the dinner table. So let's get to it. Buying a low quality brisket. This is the #1 mistake that people make when they're smoking brisket. They go to the store, they buy the cheapest cut of meat they can. Usually it's a select grade brisket and it turns out dry and they don't know what happened. What happened is select grade briskets do not have enough fat content to make a super juicy brisket. So you want to get either a choice, certified Angus beef, prime, or Wagyu. Buying a small brisket and following the recipe for a large brisket. This is the #2 mistake people make. They go to the store, they buy a 2 to 5 pound chunk of brisket, they take it home, they follow a recipe from the internet for a full packer's cut of brisket, which is 12 plus pounds, and they can't figure out why their brisket didn't turn out well. Well, you need to go find a recipe that is specifically tailored to a small cut of brisket. Buying the wrong type of brisket. You want a brisket that is 10 plus pounds. It's a full packer's cut. It has the point muscle and the flat muscle attached. You don't want to buy a corned beef brisket. You don't want to buy a brisket flat by itself. You don't want to buy a brisket point by itself. Buying a brisket with too much hard fat on it. If you need to, stand in the grocery store and pull out all the briskets. Look for the best one. Don't settle for one with a ton of hard fat in it. You can usually tell if you bend it a little. If it's super stiff, it typically has a ton of hard fat. If you're at your butcher, ask your butcher to bring out a few briskets and look for one with as little hard fat on the fat cap as possible. You're just gonna be carving all that fat off anyway, and you're gonna be throwing it in the garbage. Buying a thin brisket. Some briskets are 10 plus pounds, so they're in the normal weight range of a brisket, but they're really long and skinny. You wanna get a brisket that's shorter and thicker. That thicker meat is gonna survive better throughout the cooking process, and it's gonna produce a way more tender and juicy final product. Buying a frozen brisket. Freezing a brisket can rob it of its ability to retain moisture throughout the cooking process. So if you can at all possible, buy a brisket that hasn't been frozen and it's completely fresh. Not buying a big enough brisket to feed everyone. If you're gonna go through all of the effort to cook a brisket for 12 plus hours, then you might as well get one that is going to feed your family, your guests, and you for the rest of the week. Buying a brisket that is too big for your smoker. You don't wanna buy a huge brisket, trim it, get it all prepped, and then you're ready to throw it on the smoker and it doesn't fit. Being afraid of weird colors when you're buying a brisket. It's okay to have a little bit of browning on the edges of the brisket. In fact, the brisket is treated a little bit after it's cut, and that's what that brown color on the one side of the brisket is. If the brisket is fuzzy or it's like smelling gross or something, obviously there's something wrong with it. But if it's not bright red or like a steak that you see at the grocery store, it doesn't need to be perfect. There can be some brown spots on it, it's all right. Following a recipe that's not meant for your smoker. For example, following a oven brisket recipe. Always look for a recipe that is for your specific smoker. Going only by time or only by temperature. Time and temperature are only a guideline of when a brisket is getting to certain stages in the cooking process. The real test for when to wrap a brisket is the color of the brisket. The real test for when a brisket is done is when it probes tender. Going off random advice from Facebook or a friend. A lot of people have really good ideas about how to cook brisket, but it might be very specific to their situation. So always be careful when someone is giving you advice and check a bunch of different sources on the internet. Going off an old family or friend's recipe. A lot of brisket recipes can be really old and they might result in kind of a dry brisket. So again, check a bunch of different recipes on the internet and just make sure you're following one where the person is showing you the end result and it looks super tender and delicious. Not giving yourself enough time to smoke a brisket. You're gonna need anywhere from 12 to 20 hours for this entire process. So make sure you get up early and you plan out your cook and you plan when you're actually gonna serve this brisket. Not having a rough plan for your cook. A lot of people just follow a recipe off the internet and they just go by the recipe recipe step by step, that's not the best way to do it. You want to look at a bunch of different recipes. You want to plan out exactly when you think that your brisket is going to reach the stage of wrapping it, it's going to reach a certain temperature, and then when you think it's going to finish within a degree of error of like plus or minus a couple hours. This gives you a rough plan so that if you reach a stage within the cooking process that your brisket is doing something that doesn't really jive with the plan, you can kind of adjust what you need to do. For example, you can cook the brisket faster at a higher temperature, or you can wrap it sooner. That's going to ensure that you get your brisket done at the right time for dinner. Not accounting for trimmed fat. So a lot of people go on a time per pound recipe on the internet. For example, 1.5 hours per pound at 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, if you do that and you calculate it based on the full brisket size that you get home from the grocery store, you might trim off 5 to 8 pounds of fat, depending on how much fat there is on that brisket. So always go by the fully trimmed weight and take that into account. Not carving enough fat off your brisket. If you don't carve the fat cap down to 1/4 inch, you're gonna have a lot of fat on that brisket. And if you serve it to people, they might throw that fat away, and that's not a very nice feeling. So you want a 1/4 inch thin layer of fat on the outside. That's gonna give people a nice little bite of fat, and they're not gonna be ripping it off and throwing it away. If you like a really fatty brisket, if that's your style, then all the power to you. But most people like a little bit less fat. Trimming too much fat off of the fat cap. You need a 1/4 inch continuous layer of fat over the full surface of the brisket. This is gonna help you get a nice consistent smoke ring, so it's gonna look nice and pretty, and it's also gonna help retain moisture, and it's also gonna protect your brisket from the heat. So make sure it's a nice even layer of fat. Trimming too deep into the point muscle. There's a seam in the point muscle where it meets the flat, where there's this large vein of hard fat. You wanna carve into that and carve a lot of that away, but you don't want to keep going and going until you're making a huge cavern in the middle of your brisket. You just want to go until you have a little flap on the outside, but it's still got its structural integrity. Don't go too far and totally separate that flat and that point muscle. Not freezing your brisket before trimming it. Now, I know I said don't freeze your brisket, but you can freeze it for about 30 minutes to an hour, and that's just, it's not gonna freeze it, it's just gonna firm up the fat, so it's a lot easier to carve. If you're trimming room temperature fat, then it's gonna be really hard to trim that fat nice and evenly, so always freeze it for about 30 minutes to an hour before you start trimming. Not trimming the silver skin on the bottom of the brisket. This took me a long time to learn as well. If you flip the brisket over to the meat side, there's a small little thin sheet of silver skin, and you need to trim that off. It's just tissue that doesn't render down, and it just tightens up and it gets kind of chewy at the end of the brisket cook. So take a really sharp knife, lift the brisket up with your hand underneath it, and then shave that silver skin off. Scoring the fat cap. This is something that I used to do when I first started smoking brisket, and honestly, it's not a really good idea. It involves scoring little squares in the fat cap, and the theory is that it lets more smoke and spices get to the meat. The problem is it also lets a lot more moisture out, and it also lets a lot more heat get to that meat. You want that continuous layer of fat on the outside of the brisket. Not landmarking your brisket. When you're trimming your brisket, it's a really good idea to go to the flat end of the brisket, make a small perpendicular cut to the grain of the meat, and that is going to tell you which direction to slice your knife at the end of the day when you're slicing your brisket, because otherwise it's really hard to see through the thick dark bark at the end of the cook which direction the grain is running, so you can slice directly against the grain. Not following proper hygiene. It's always a good idea to wipe the cryovac bag down when you get home from the store, just to clean up that brisket, make sure there's no pathogens getting on other stuff in your fridge. Obviously, it's all gonna be burned off when you cook it, but it can also get cross-contaminated with other stuff in your fridge. Always make sure you have a dry hand and a wet hand when you're applying rub and you're touching other things that you're not necessarily gonna clean off later. And just be mindful that there's brisket juice flying everywhere when you're trimming, and try to keep clean at all times. Not trimming off bits of the brisket that won't survive the cook. It's hard to trim off brisket and throw it away because I know you spent a lot of money on it, but it's a good idea to trim the thinner edges of the flat off, because those are just gonna get really crispy and they're not gonna survive the cook anyway. Using a sugar-heavy rub. You don't wanna use the same rub that you're going to use for ribs on a brisket. Brisket is way better without a lot of sugar. Sugar is great with pork ribs or a pork butt or a pork shoulder. It just doesn't go as well with brisket. Using too much salt. This is a big mistake that I see a lot of people make. They go and buy a commercial rub with a lot of salt in it already, and then they apply a little bit of salt on the outside of the brisket and then layer that rub on top of it. Very common mistake because a lot of recipes call for applying the salt separately and then people put their rub on. You're basically double salting your brisket, and that can lead to a very salty brisket. Not using sharp knives. This is something that I'm personally guilty of. I went a long time without getting a really sharp knife, and it makes trimming a brisket really difficult and actually dangerous because you can cut yourself. If you're really trying to struggle with a dull knife and it slips and cuts through something and then it cuts into your hand, you're gonna have a bad day. And if you're on a budget, all you have to do is get a $10 knife like this, get a $10 sharpener off Amazon like this, and every time you go to trim your brisket or cut into your brisket, just give it a sharpen on this cheap sharpener a couple times. It's like honing it, but it's better than honing it because this thing actually shaves the metal off and sharpens it a little bit, and you're not worried about screwing this knife up because it's only a $10 knife. So get yourself this, 20 bucks total, and this will give you a good knife system to trim up your brisket. Not using enough salt in your rub. If you're making your own rub at home, you have to keep in mind the ratio of salt to everything else. In a rub, there's two main ingredients, salt and all the other stuff you want to add in. Salt is the most important thing you're adding to your rub. So if you have 1 tablespoon of salt in your rub mixture and you have 1 tablespoon of pepper, then that's going to be a lot saltier than a rub with 1 tablespoon of salt, 1 tablespoon of pepper, 1 tablespoon of paprika, chili powder, cumin, all this other stuff. That is going to bring the ratio of the salt down. So you always want to keep that ratio of salt that you're aiming for consistent because you don't want to dilute it in the rub with other ingredients that you're adding. Not pre-resting your brisket before you put it on the smoker. Pre-resting your brisket is when you apply the rub, you want to let it sit at room temperature for about 30 minutes to an hour. That salt is going to draw out some of the moisture from the brisket. It's going to commingle with all the rest of the spices in that moisture, and it's going to help with the bark formation. So if you don't let it rest and let the salt do its magic for about 30 minutes to an hour, then you're going to put it on the smoker and you might still have really big grains of salt that never get a chance to draw out that moisture and dissolve and create that awesome bark layer. Letting your brisket pre-rest for too long. A lot of people, they apply their rub and then they wrap it in either foil or plastic wrap and leave it in the fridge overnight. That's probably fine, but if you leave it for a couple days, then you're actually dry brining it, and that brisket could turn out a lot like pastrami or taste like beef jerky. It's a little bit too much time for that salt to penetrate too deeply into the brisket, and the flavor is just not what we usually expect when we want brisket. Not letting the brisket temper at room temperature. Tempering is when you bring your brisket out of the fridge and you leave it at room temperature so it can rise in temperature a little bit, so it has less of a temperature journey when you put it onto the smoker. This is going to allow you to cook the brisket faster and more evenly. So what I like to do is I take the brisket out of the fridge in the morning. It's already been trimmed the night before. Apply my rub, and then I just leave it there at room temperature for about an hour to an hour and a half. And when I do that, I'm letting it temper and come up in temperature, and also I'm letting it pre-rest so all those spices and the salt can work their magic on the outside of the brisket. Wet brining your brisket. Now, brisket is probably one of the only cuts of meat where I wouldn't recommend wet brining it as part of the cooking process. Now, if you're doing pastrami or Montreal smoked meat, then you actually do need to wet brine it as part of the process. But for a traditional Texas style brisket or any type of barbecue brisket that you cook on a smoker, it's not a good idea to brine it because it's going to taste a little bit like beef jerky, and the texture is just not going to be the same as if you didn't wet brine it. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to wet brine this brisket just to show you guys how it turns out, but I typically would not recommend wet brining a brisket for any length of time. Not cleaning your grates. This is a big issue that I have because after a long day of smoking a brisket, the last thing I want to do is clean my grates, but then the next time you go to cook your brisket, you're going to open up your cooker and it's going to be gross and nasty, and it's just one more step when you're already really busy and you need to put that brisket onto the smoker as fast as possible because it's going to be a long day. So I really recommend after every time you finish a cook to give your grates a clean. They're already hot and warm and they'll be easy to clean off. Not positioning your brisket correctly on your specific type of smoker. This is a big problem that people have. They always have the fat cap up versus fat cap down debate, and I actually believe that you need to have the fat cap towards the heat source. That's always worked the best for me. So on a pellet smoker, you want the fat cap down. And for the purposes of this video, I'm going to smoke this brisket with the fat cap up at 275 degrees Fahrenheit, so you guys can actually see what happens when you don't cook on a pellet smoker with the fat cap down. On an offset smoker, usually the fat cap should be up because the convection current and that heat that's going from the firebox to the stack is going over the brisket. It's kind of like an airplane, like Aaron Franklin says. It's going like that. So you want the fat on the top, so it's protecting that brisket from that current. Other smokers, the Masterbuilt electric smoker or any electric smoker, the heat source is usually coming from the bottom, so you want your fat cap down, similar to on a pellet smoker. A drum smoker, usually you want the fat cap down. A Weber Smoky Mountain, you want the fat cap down. With a Weber grill, I usually smoke it with the fat cap up because I do a 2-zone cooking process, so the heat is really coming up from the coals on the one side and then it's going up and over the brisket. It's not coming from underneath. So that is the only exception where on a Weber kettle, I would smoke with the fat cap up. Incorrect meat placement on your smoker. You want your brisket positioned so that the point muscle is facing the heat source because that point muscle can take a lot of heat and the flat, which is thinner, cannot take a lot of heat. So you want the brisket as far from the heat source as possible. So on an offset smoker, that's as close to the exhaust on the far side of the cooker as possible. And you also want that point facing the heat source, and you want it positioned in the area that you're collecting the temperature for. So you always want to collect temperature at grate level, so make sure you're cooking that brisket exactly where you're collecting that temperature. Messing up the presentation side of a brisket. A lot of the brisket cooking process is kind of a little bit of theater, in my opinion. Like, if you're serving it to a large group of people or your family, you want it to look as good as possible. You want to carry out this brisket, take out your big slicing knife and then carve it in front of everyone. Like, that's part of the experience of barbecuing a brisket for me. So when you're prepping your brisket, you always want to make sure that you don't mess up the rub on the presentation side. So if you're cooking your brisket fat side up, you want to apply the rub on the bottom non-fat side first, flip it over, because that rub is getting a little bit messed up, but it doesn't matter because it's going to get messed up when you put it on the grate anyway. And then you carefully apply your rub to the fat side and you make it all nice and pretty, and then you put it on the smoker, and you're not going to be messing with that top spice rub layer anymore, and it's going to look really nice at the end of the cook. Giving up when you think your smoker is too small for your brisket. There's always a way, in most cases, to cook your brisket on any size of smoker. You can always separate the point from the flat and cook them on top of each other, or you can wrap it around itself in like a C shape, and then once it shrinks down a little bit, you can lay it flat again. Or on an electric smoker, you can smoke it on an angle with an angled rack, and then again, once it shrinks down a little bit in the cooking process, you can put it back down on the horizontal rack and it'll fit. So never give up before thinking through the process and thinking about how you can fit that brisket into your smoker. Not using real wood on an offset smoker. There's a reason that offset smokers are called stick burners. You're supposed to use them with actual splits of hardwood. So if you have an offset smoker and you've been trying to get the temperatures consistent and get everything right with charcoal alone, you're just shoveling charcoal in there every hour, that's not really the best way to do it. It's always a good idea to get yourself some nice dry, preferably kiln dried splits of hardwood, and that is going to make your life 100% easier if you're cooking on an offset smoker. Using green wood in your offset smoker. This is a big mistake that people make on an offset smoker. They go and they buy the cheapest wood they can get that's hardwood, and then they take it home and they throw it on the smoker and it starts steaming and smoking and bubbling. That's because the wood is wet and it hasn't had a chance to season or dry properly yet. So you want to bring that internal water content of your wood down to around 10% preferably. So usually you get that by either kiln drying it or you can season it. It has to be seasoned for a year or two before you can actually burn it. If you burn green wood, if it even burns at all in your smoker, then you're gonna produce a lot of creosote, you're gonna produce a lot of bitter flavors in your meat, so you wanna stay away from it. Not using a moisture meter. You can pick up a moisture meter on Amazon for about 20 bucks and you're gonna have it for the rest of your life, and you'll be able to always know what the internal moisture content of the wood that you're burning is. So the wood should be below 20% at the very least. If it's any higher than that, then it's considered green wood and you don't want to burn that. It needs to be seasoned for longer or kiln dried. And I actually use my Masterbuilt electric smoker to kiln dry my wood to a moisture content of about 10%. It works so much better on the offset smoker when you're burning wood that's that dry. Burning the wrong type of wood. So this goes hand in hand with burning green wood. You don't want to burn green wood. You don't want to burn a lot of mesquite because mesquite can give you a really intense flavor. So if that's not what you're going for, then stay away from mesquite hardwood. Also, don't smoke any softwoods. Do an internet search before you buy some wood to make sure that you can smoke that wood and it's a hardwood smoke that is actually safe for barbecue. Now, one thing I would say is a lot of people smoke with mesquite. I'm just talking to the majority of people who have never barbecued before and they're picking up mesquite expecting it to taste like oak or cherry or something more mild, and then they get like a really intense, powerful flavor without actually going for that. Bad fire management. You really want to make sure that you are dialing your temperatures in so that they're consistent. If they're going up to 300 and then down to 200 and then up to 300 in the next 20 minutes after you add a big chunk of hardwood, then you're gonna have a bad day and you're not gonna produce really good barbecue. So if you have an offset smoker, a Kamado, a water smoker like a Weber Smoky Mountain, where fire management is very important, do a couple trial runs to make sure that you can get a nice consistent temperature before you actually start barbecuing in it. I did a great video on offset smoker fire management that I'll link right here if you guys wanna check that out. Running out of fuel. This is one of the worst things that can happen, and I've been on long cooks on my pellet smoker where I've actually run out of pellets, and then you're kind of screwed because you have nothing to smoke with anymore. On an offset smoker, I've run out of hardwood splits, and then I have only charcoal left over to burn, which is not the end of the world, but you always want to make sure that you're fully stocked on the type of fuel that you need before you actually start the cooking process. It can burn a lot faster than you think if it's windy outside, if it's rainy, if it's cold, so always be prepared and have a stockpile of enough fuel for your entire cooking process. Not using thermometers. Do yourself a favor, if you don't have a instant read thermometer, go out to the store and buy one. It helps out a lot for knowing where the brisket is at different stages of the cooking process. And it's also very helpful at the end of the cooking process to probe the brisket for tenderness, which is the real test of when a brisket is done. The second piece of thermometry you need to get is a probe thermometer, something you can put at grate level directly before the heat hits the brisket, where you can measure that ambient temperature, because that is going to tell you your fire management temperature that you need to maintain consistently. Going off the dome thermometer or another built-in thermometer. This is a big mistake I see a lot of people making. They go off of the built-in dome thermometer on their offset smoker or their Weber Smoky Mountain or their Kamado style smoker. That can be off by up to 50 degrees from what the temperature actually is at grate level. So a lot of people post briskets on forums and they're like, what happened to my brisket? And in a lot of cases, they're just not cooking at the temperature that they thought they were cooking at because they're going off of an incorrect temperature reading on the built-in dome thermometer, which can often be wrong. Going off of temperature alone. Temperature is only an indicator of when your brisket is reaching different stages of the cooking process. So when it hits around 165 degrees internal temperature, that's usually in most cases when people wrap it, because that's the temperature when the bark starts to get nice and dark. But sometimes it could take all the way up to 195 degrees Fahrenheit to get that bark at the right color where you want it. So temperature is always just an indicator. Incorrect probe placement. So if you're going off a recipe that goes by temperature, then always put that temperature probe in the thickest part of the flat right underneath the point. That is the spot that is going to cook the slowest, and it's where the most accurate temperature reading will be. If you put your probe in the tip of the flat where the meat is really thin, it's always going to cook faster and it's going to have a really high reading that's going to be a lot higher than that actual sweet spot in the middle of the brisket. Same with the point. If you put it just on the tip of the point, it could give you an inaccurate reading. So always put it right in the center of the brisket, thickest part of the flat, right underneath the point. Not having heat-resistant gloves to handle your brisket. A lot of people use tongs to pick up their brisket, and then they end up messing up all that bark and scraping off that bark from the brisket. So you need to get yourself some nice gloves. What I use are some really heavy-duty black leather gloves, and I bought a whole bunch of cotton gloves to protect myself from the heat. So I put one hand in a cotton glove, and then I put one hand in my big, thick rubber gloves here. And these are reusable, that's why I like them, but I also sometimes use disposable gloves, and that gives you a little bit more dexterity because the rubber is not as thick. If you're more budget conscious, you can also use these silicone mitts. As long as they're heat resistant and waterproof, then you're good to go. Cooking at the wrong temperature for your smoker. If you're cooking a brisket at 300 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take, on an offset smoker, that is producing much more gentle heat because it's a lot of convective heat and air currents coming from the firebox. it's a lot more gentle than, say, a pellet smoker that has a big heat deflector on it, a drip pan, that is absorbing a lot of that heat from underneath on the fire pot side, and it's transferring heat and energy to the brisket via radiant heat off of that heat deflector plate. So you're getting convective heat plus the radiant heat from that heat deflector, and that radiant heat is not so gentle. It can actually burn your brisket if it's too high, and that's why I'm showing you guys in this video an example of cooking on a pellet smoker with the fat side up and the meat side exposed to that hot deflector plate at 275 degrees Fahrenheit, because I want you guys to see that it actually dries out and can burn the underside of the brisket quite easily. So all of that is to say that on an offset smoker, you might be able to smoke all the way up to 325 degrees Fahrenheit, because that convective heat is a lot more gentle and won't burn your brisket. But if you're cooking on a pellet grill, you might not want to bump it up to 275 or 300 because you've got that heat plate and all that radiant energy to deal with. Cooking at the wrong temperature for your brisket. So Myron Mixon cooks hot and fast at 300 degrees Fahrenheit because he's using Wagyu beef. This is a super high quality cut of beef with a ton of fat in it, and it can handle the heat. If you're getting a select brisket or even a choice brisket, it doesn't have a lot of that fat in it, and if you're cooking it at high heat, it might not turn out the same way that Myron Mixon's Wagyu briskets turn out, for example. So always cook low and slow on low fat content cuts of meat. And if you're gonna cook hot and fast, get at least a choice grade or a prime, because it needs that fat to protect itself from the heat and retain that moisture. Cooking at the wrong temperature, period. Now, there are some temperatures where you just don't want to cook a brisket at those temperatures. 180 degrees Fahrenheit, you don't want to cook a brisket throughout the whole cooking process at 180 because it's going to dry it out and it's going to take forever. It'll take days to finish. Now, the only exception is if you're on a pellet smoker and you smoke it at a 180 to 190 just for the first few hours to give it a bit of extra smoke, and then you bump it up to 225 plus. That's more than okay, but don't go at super sub 200 degree Fahrenheit temperatures throughout the whole cook. It's just not going to turn out the way you think it is. And on the other end of the extreme, don't cook your brisket at 325 degrees plus. Anything over 325 degrees Fahrenheit is generally considered crazy for a brisket. Misusing your water pan. Now, if you're smoking on an offset smoker, it's always a good idea to have a water pan right in the main cooking chamber, right by the firebox, because it's going to provide a little bit more moisture and it's going to even out the heat in the cooking chamber. Now, if you're cooking on an electric smoker, like a Masterbuilt electric smoker, I usually do not have a water pan going for the first half of the cook because there's not a lot of airflow in these units and there's already a ton of moisture in that brisket that's getting trapped within the cooking chamber. So you're almost creating like a steaming effect inside of the electric smoker. You don't need to add a full water pan and make the problem even worse. If you do want to add water to the water pan in an electric smoker, then wait for about 4 hours first, because you want to give that brisket a dry enough environment for that bark to set up. All that moisture and steam inside of an electric smoker is going to really inhibit bark formation. For any other smoker, offset smoker, Weber Smoky Mountain, a Weber kettle, always a good idea to have a water pan, have it from the very start and continue to refill it. This is very important because it's going to evaporate and it could actually empty completely. So you want to make sure that thing is always full of warm water. Not understanding how a smoke ring is formed. Now, for those of you that don't know, a smoke ring is that nice pink ring around the outside of your meat. It's formed by a chemical reaction that happens when you have combustible gases from either fire or charcoal. They burn off and they produce nitrous oxide. This nitrous oxide interfaces and interacts with the outside of the meat. It gets mixed in with the myoglobin in the meat and it produces a chemical reaction that produces that pink ring. It's not undercooked meat, it's just a chemical reaction. Now, if you're using an electric smoker, you might not be able to get a smoke ring because it just doesn't reach the combustion temperatures and the flame and the fire that is needed to produce enough gases to produce that chemical reaction. So a lot of people get around it by adding curing salts to the brisket beforehand to create a sort of fake smoke ring. And the other thing about smoke rings is people often post pictures of their briskets and they're wondering, hey, why is my smoke ring patchy or it didn't form nice and uniform? It's usually because there's like a patchy layer of fat on the outside, and in order for that chemical reaction to happen, the gases need to get through the fat and they're not interacting with the fat or changing the fat pink. and then only when they hit the actual meat layer are they going to start changing it pink. So if you have a brisket that is not uniformly carved with a uniform fat cap, then you might have a little bit of a patchy smoke ring on the outside of the meat. Smoking with thick white smoke. Now, when you're smoking barbecue, you always want to go for thin blue smoke. This is kind of the gold standard that everyone's shooting for. You should barely be able to see the smoke coming out of your vent stack, and you just have like a little wavy puff of smoke and like a steam of hot air coming out. That is when you know you're getting the right type of smoke. If you're smoking with thick white smoke, the brisket is going to turn out a little bit acrid and bitter. It's going to have a lot of big smoke particles on it, and it's going to get really dark and black. The only exception would be on electric smokers. You're always going to get thick white smoke. That's just how electric smokers work. Looking too much. Now, there's that old saying, if you're looking, you ain't cooking. And this is so true. If you're looking at your brisket every hour and opening that lid, the ambient temperature is plummeting, and it's also bringing down the internal temperature of the brisket. So when you close it, the ambient temperature has to come up to temperature, and then it actually has to pull that brisket temperature back up from the low it just came to when you opened it to look at it. So if you're doing that every hour, that's going to add up. It's going to add probably 20 minutes to your cook time every time you open it up and take a quick peek. Not looking at your brisket enough. Okay, so now that I've said don't look at your brisket too often, there are two essential times when you need to look at your brisket. The first one is to check on color. This is going to tell you when you need to wrap your brisket. So at around the 4 to 5 hour mark, you want to check on your brisket and see how the color and the bark formation is doing and whether the bark is setting up. If the bark is set up and it's at the color you want it, then you're going to wrap it right there. So you've only opened it once at this point. The second essential time when you want to look at your brisket is when it's getting close to done. So when that internal temperature is getting to the 190 to 200 zone, that's when you want to start doing your checks for doneness. And you want to keep checking probably every half an hour after that. So you're going to be checking a lot during the end of the process to make sure that you're pulling it out at the right point. But otherwise, in the first half of the cook, you really want to aim to look at it as little as possible, preferably only once, and maybe a couple more times if you're spritzing your brisket. Not paying attention or trying to do too much. If you have a bunch of chores to do during the day while smoking your brisket, you might want to rethink your plans a little bit, especially if you're using an offset smoker. Offset smokers need constant babysitting to ensure the temperatures stay consistent. On a pellet smoker or electric smoker, you might be able to get away with it, but you still need to pay attention to what's going on with that brisket. So always make sure you carve out a day to sit by the smoker, have a couple beverages, enjoy it, enjoy the experience, enjoy the barbecue lifestyle. Try not to get too stressed out doing too much, and your brisket is going to turn out way better. Not spraying your brisket. So this is a controversial one because there is some evidence out there that spraying your brisket doesn't really do as much as people think, and it might not actually do anything at all. But it is part of the barbecue religion, and a lot of people do it. A lot of pit masters will swear by it. So the one thing I will say for sure is if you're smoking on an offset smoker, a Weber Smoky Mountain, a Weber kettle, something where you can get wild temperature swings if you're not careful, or hot spots easily, you want to open up and look at that brisket, and if there's some crispy edges to it, that's when you want to spritz, and you want to spray those crispy edges because you want to slow the cooking process down on those particular parts of the meat. That is usually when I use my spray bottle. Spraying too much. It's really easy to overspray your brisket and wash off all of the spices and the bark on the outside of it. So be really careful and only hit the dry areas. That brisket is going to sweat out a lot of moisture, so just trust the process and trust that your brisket has enough moisture that it's going to hydrate itself without your help. Spraying your brisket too early. If you're spraying your brisket before about the 4 hour mark, the 1 to 4 hour mark, you're inhibiting bark formation and you're making it a lot harder for that bark to set up. So always wait at least 4 hours before you start spraying it. Bad drainage on your brisket. So at about the 4 hour mark, when the brisket really starts sweating out a lot of moisture, you can get a little pocket or a pool in the middle of the brisket where all of that moisture is coming and it's bubbling to the surface. And if you leave that pool as it is, it's going to really inhibit the bark formation in that one area, and you'll have this spot with no bark. So a lot of people will stick a beer can underneath their brisket or a chunk of wood to make the brisket have better drainage. And also sometimes I will just go in with a paper towel and kind of mop up some of that liquid as it comes to the surface because it can really inhibit your bark formation. Not using your discretion and intuition throughout the cooking process. Now, cooking a brisket is not an exact science. You can't follow a recipe and expect to consistently reproduce the same results. It's an art. You have to look at your brisket. If the edges are getting a little bit crispy, spritz it down a little bit. If the bottom is getting a little bit burnt, then move it to a colder spot of the smoker, or flip it over, or rotate it. Use your brain and think about what you need to do and what is going to turn out a better brisket. Not understanding the stall. The stall is what happens when the brisket hits a certain temperature zone. It's anywhere from 140 to 165 degrees internal temperature. It'll start sweating out so much moisture and steam that it'll actually start cooling the brisket by evaporative cooling. So you'll get this period where you're ramping up in temperature and then it's just gonna flatline. And some people panic at that point and they do some bad things like raising the temperature way too high or doing some other crazy things. So there's 3 ways to get out of the stall. You can just wait out the stall. This is what a lot of people do. They just wait out that stall, and when the brisket loses enough moisture, it's gonna start rising in temperature again after a few hours. Second thing you can do is you can raise the temperature on your smoker. Usually not recommended, but if you wanna finish your brisket faster, you can pump it up by a couple degrees just to power through that stall. The third way is you can wrap your brisket. So you can wrap it in aluminum foil. That's called the Texas crutch, or you can wrap it in butcher's paper. That lets a little bit more of the steam out and produces a better bark because you're not dissolving the bark as much. Not wrapping your brisket at all. Now, some people like to do naked briskets. They don't wrap it at all throughout the cooking process. They wait out the stall and they wait until it probes tender. Takes a lot longer to finish your brisket, but you get better bark usually. So if you're doing it that way, then you're gonna have to do some more spritzing and spraying throughout the process to retain that moisture that would have been retained by wrapping it. Not wrapping by bark formation and color. So this is a common mistake. People are going off a recipe that says wrap your brisket as soon as it hits 165 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, in most cases, the bark color and the bark formation will be set at that 165 degree level, but in a lot of cases it might not be as well. So it might take all the way up to 175, 185 to get that bark to the right color and to get that bark set on your particular smoker. Wrapping too early. This is a big mistake. If you're wrapping your brisket at like the 3-hour mark when it's only 140 degrees Fahrenheit, or it hasn't gone all the way through the stall and evaporated a lot of that moisture out, that brisket is going to leak out all its moisture into the foil or the butcher's paper. It's going to ruin any bark that you had a chance to form, and it's just gonna be like a really soggy exterior. So always wait until you get that nice color on your brisket and then wrap it at that point. Not wrapping tight enough. So with aluminum foil, you wanna really tightly wrap that brisket to hold everything in, to hold all that steam and the liquid in. You don't want any leaks because your brisket could dry out if there's a pinhole leak and it's leaking everywhere. With butcher's paper, it's also important to wrap it tightly because the brisket fat is coming to the surface of the brisket. It's soaking that butcher's paper, and then that greasy paper is actually forming a protective layer on the outside of the brisket that is holding all that moisture in. So with butcher's paper, it's very important to have it super tight so it can get greasy and it can create that outer layer. Not wrapping select grade briskets early. Now, this is the one exception to the don't wrap too early rule that I said earlier. Select grade briskets just kind of suck. They don't have a lot of fat in them, so it's better to wrap early and retain as much moisture as possible. Not using the right type of wrap. Now, if you're doing Texas crutch with aluminum foil, use heavy duty aluminum foil, double up on it if you need to. You don't want any leaks. If you're using butcher's paper, this is the kind of butcher's paper you want. You want unlined butcher's paper, and you shouldn't be able to feel any sort of plasticky kind of surface to it. It should just feel like paper. That's the kind of butcher's paper you want. It's gonna soak up all that grease and it's gonna produce that protective layer, and it's not gonna have any nasty BPAs or plastic stuff leaching into your food. This is the type of butcher's paper that you don't want to get. It's got a little bit of a sheen to it. That's a plastic layer on it. And I did use this butcher's paper for a long time until someone pointed out to me that this is lined butcher's paper. And, you know, I feel fine. It didn't really hurt me and it did the job. But I highly recommend that you get the unlined butcher's paper because that is going to produce the best brisket and it's going to be the safest. Not adding liquid to your wrap. Now, this applies only when you're wrapping with aluminum foil. I usually like to add at least 1/3 of a cup to 1/2 cup of beef stock and maybe some other stuff just to provide some extra liquid, because I push my briskets through the stall until they've lost a lot of moisture before I wrap it, because I don't want my bark getting soggy when I wrap. So it's important, if you do that, to add back a little bit more moisture to the bottom of that layer of foil. It's just going to add more moisture to the brisket, and when it's done, it's going to suck that moisture back into the meat as it cools back down and rests. Checking your temperatures too early after wrapping your brisket. This is a big problem when people poke their thermometer into the tin foil or through the butcher's paper. It lets a lot of that steam out and it breaks the continuous barrier that is keeping all of that moisture in. And if they poke too far, they can actually poke through the bottom of the wrap and they can actually drain all of that liquid out through that hole. So it's always a good idea to wait at least 2 hours after you wrap it to start checking your temperatures, because you want the internal environment of that wrapped brisket to get up to temperature and start creating steam and retaining moisture. Waiting too long to check your temperature after you wrap your brisket. So I just said that you should wait at least 2 hours before poking into that wrap, but you shouldn't wait too much longer after that before you start checking for temperature and doneness, because it can start going off like a freight train inside of that wrap job. That temperature is going up like crazy after the 2 hour mark. So you want to make sure you're not leaving it too long because you could overcook your brisket. Rushing the finish. So a lot of people will have a dinner deadline coming up in the next 2 hours and their brisket is only at like 165 degrees Fahrenheit. So they crank the temperature up and it turns out to be a dry brisket. You don't want that to happen to you. So you can increase the temperature a little bit after it's wrapped. So if you're cooking at 250 degrees Fahrenheit, you could go all the way up to 300 once it's wrapped, because that wrap job is going to protect the meat from all that extra heat. You don't want to go much higher than that though. And if all else fails, you can just take your brisket, cook it normally, finish it the correct way, rest it, and then just reheat it the next day. Order some pizza for tonight's dinner if the brisket isn't done on time. It's going to turn out to be a way better brisket, and you don't want to serve up a brisket to your family and guests that's overcooked or dry, because that's going to affect your reputation. You don't want to be known as the guy that can't cook a brisket. Not using the 3 finishing tests. So a lot of people just go by temperature, and when it hits the temperature that their recipe says a brisket's done, they pull it out, and it's too tough or it's overcooked. You need to know the other 2 finishing tests. The first one, and the most important one, is it needs to probe like room temperature butter. So get yourself a thermometer probe, and when you probe into the brisket, it should almost feel like room temperature butter. There should be very little resistance. And the third test is the feel test. So take your heat resistant gloves, your silicone gloves, put your fingers underneath the brisket and, give it a little jiggle. Make sure that it's nice and flexible. It's not too stiff. If it's kind of wobbly and like jello, then it's probably getting close to being done, or it's done already. Not waiting until your brisket probes tender. This is probably the #1 brisket mistake from this whole video. People don't go by the probe test. Your brisket needs to probe tender, so when you insert your probe into the thickest part of the flat in the middle of the brisket, right underneath the point, it should probe like you're probing into room temperature butter. If it's not at that stage and there's still resistance, do not take it out of the smoker. Continue cooking and just trust that it will get tender over time. A lot of people will pull their brisket before it gets probe tender, and then they'll rest it in a cooler. And the cooler actually saves them, because the temperature doesn't go down a lot when you put it in a cooler, so it could stay at that 200 zone for quite a long time, up to an hour before it starts going down to 190 and lower. So it's actually continuing to cook, and it might actually get probe tender while it's in the cooler. So some people are saved by that, but you don't want to leave it up to chance. You always want to continue to cook it until it probes tender in that thickest part of the flat. Not knowing what probe tender means. Okay, so I told you guys that you need to finish your brisket when it's probe tender, but I could tell you that, it's like inserting your probe into room temperature butter. It's like putting it into a bag of melted butter. It's like putting it into a container of peanut butter or something like that. But even those rules of thumb might not be accurate in some situations. What I like to tell people is you always want to start checking it when it hits the 190 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit zone. And it's probably not going to be done at that point, but you get a benchmark. You insert your probe into the thickest part of the flat under the point, and you can feel the resistance, and then you have something to go off of. So in the next half an hour to an hour, when you check it again, you'll slide your probe in and you'll remember how it felt. And if it's way more tender than when it felt before, it's probably done. And if it feels exactly like it did when you checked it the last time, it's probably got too much resistance and it's not done. So you won't have to really do this as much when you get more experienced and you learn what probe tender means for your specific cooking process and your specific cut of meat that you buy. You'll just get that ingrained into you and you'll become a more experienced pitmaster, and you'll just know by feel when it's done. The other thing is that the gauge or the diameter of your probe is very important. Some people say it needs to probe tender with and they use a toothpick, and some people use a therm pen like me, which is a much wider diameter. So you need to get the feel of what a therm pen feels like and the resistance that it needs to have when it's probe tender, versus if you're using a toothpick, that might be completely different. So always use the same diameter of probe, and that is going to be your brisket probe for the rest of your life, and that's what you're gonna go off of to know when your brisket is done. Pulling your brisket when the point probe's tender. This is another big mistake. People probe into the point muscle, which is a lot fattier. It gets a lot more tender, a lot faster, and that might probe tender, but the thickest part of the flat is still pretty tough, and you're gonna have a tough brisket. So always probe into the thickest part of the flat right underneath the point. Don't just check the point or the tip of the flat for doneness. Overcooking your brisket. This is another big mistake that people make. There's a point in time that the brisket will probe tender in that thickest part of the flat, and it'll be perfect when you slice into it. It'll just have a little bit of elasticity and resistance, but it'll break apart easily. It'll be tender and moist. If you pull the brisket too soon before it reaches that point, it's gonna be really tough. But if you wait too long, it's going to be really crumbly and dry. So you're gonna slice into it, it's gonna kind of mush into the brisket, and then when you pull it apart, it's almost gonna fall apart. So it's gonna have more of like a pot roast type taste and consistency, and that is not the flavor of brisket that we normally wanna go for. Not pushing past the second stall. A lot of people don't know what the second stall is. The second stall happens when you hit around the 190 to 200 degree mark. I would say in about 10 to 15% of briskets that I've cooked, I've hit a stall where it stops in that temperature zone and it doesn't increase in temperature for even up to 2 hours. You kind of just have to push through that and keep waiting, and always remember that the final test, and always go by this test, is the probe tender test. Not resting your brisket. Now this would be just crazy. If you didn't rest your brisket at all, it's going to be really dry, because when you cut into it, it's going to be so hot and it hasn't had a chance to reabsorb all of that moisture and the juices. It's just going to shoot out all of this steam and moisture, and you're going to be left with like a really bone dry slice of brisket. So always rest your brisket for at least 1 hour. It's doing two things. You're giving it time to reabsorb some of the moisture and the juices that are surrounding it and recirculate those within the meat. And you're also lowering the temperature, which is also helping it to retain more of that moisture. Not venting your brisket before you rest it. So if you've wrapped your brisket in butcher's paper or aluminum foil, it's always a good idea to open up that foil or that butcher's paper and let the steam vent out for about 15 minutes, because you want to stop the cooking process. You've already done the probe tender test. You know that your brisket is perfectly cooked. You don't want it to continue to cook while it's resting. So vent your brisket for 15 minutes, then cover it back up, throw a towel on it, and then let it rest for at least an hour. Not resting your brisket for long enough. So some recipes say rest your brisket for 15 minutes. That's just not enough time to rest your brisket. It needs to be at least an hour. And if you're checking temperatures, this is another time when you want to check temperatures, you want to come down to around 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the perfect temperature when you know it's got a good rest period and you know it's had a chance to reabsorb a lot of that moisture. And it's also going to oxidize less because it's at a lower temperature when you slice into it. Resting your brisket for too long. Now, if you get below the 140 degrees Fahrenheit mark, that's when you start getting into food safety issue territory. So I think a few hours at that 140 or below mark isn't gonna hurt you. Like, you put a ton of salt on that brisket, it's a big cut of meat, it's probably not gonna get exposed to too much bacteria. I personally wouldn't leave it out on the counter overnight. I'd put it in the fridge. So just be careful that you're not leaving your brisket, especially like on a hot day or in the sun, for hours on end. As soon as it drops below that 140 mark, then that's when you have to start worrying about it and either put it in the fridge or reheat it back up to 165. Using a cooler improperly. So there are circumstances where I would recommend using a cooler. If your recipe calls for resting it in a cooler after pulling your brisket at a certain temperature, then follow the recipe. You want to go by that recipe, and maybe part of that recipe needs the extra cooking in that cooler to make that brisket as tender as the recipe intends. The second reason I would use a cooler is if I was at a barbecue competition or if I finished my brisket too early and I wanted to hold it within the safe temperature zone before I actually hit the dinner or the competition turn-in mark. So if you finish your brisket a little bit too early and it's like 4 or 5 hours until dinner, you can put some hot water into a cooler, dump that hot water out, so you're just preheating it. Put the brisket in there with some aluminum foil, fill it up with towels to get rid of the dead space, the dead air inside the cooler, and it'll keep that brisket above 140 degrees Fahrenheit for probably about 4 hours, maybe as much as 5 hours or more depending on how hot it is outside. Giving up when you get bad bark. So there might be cases when you open up the aluminum foil or the butcher's paper, you look at the bark and it's kind of all dissolved off and it doesn't look the way you want it to. Don't give up at that point. You can always let it rest normally, and after it's rested, you put it back on the smoker for an hour or two to build up that bark again. The brisket is going to turn out just as juicy as it was because it's not going to rise in temperature too much. It's already in the rest zone, and you're just giving it a little bit extra time to get a little bit more bark formation on the outside. So you can always do that if you need to firm up the bark. Giving up if you get a tough brisket. So in a lot of cases, people will take their brisket, rest it normally, follow everything, and they still slice into it and it's tough. Don't give up at that point. There's a couple things you can do to help with that. You can slice your slices thinner so it'll pull apart more easily, or you could slice everything up and drizzle some beef stock all over top of them in an aluminum foil pan, put them back in the oven, and then cook them at around 300 until they start getting tender again. Or you could make a chili with them, or you could just put it back on the smoker and continue to cook it more until it gets tender. Not understanding if your brisket is underdone or overdone. Your brisket is underdone if it's tough when you slice into it. It's overdone if it crumbles and falls apart and it tastes like a pot roast. It's perfectly done if you slice it into 1/4-inch slices against the grain, and when you pull apart the strand of brisket, it'll have a little bit of elasticity and resistance, but it'll break apart easily. Not slicing your brisket correctly. So you always want to slice your brisket against the grain, starting at the flat. You have your landmark that I suggested earlier in this video. You go off that and cut the brisket slices in 1/4-inch slices directly against the grain, and then you switch the direction of your cuts when you reach the point muscle because those are running in a different direction. If you need to know what direction the grain is running, you can always take a fork or a knife or something and just peel back some of the bark, and then you'll be able to see the strands underneath and see what direction they're running. Not having a sharp slicing knife. So I use a really long slicing knife to carve my briskets, and it's incredibly sharp. And you need that sharpness because you need to slice through the sort of delicate, crispy outer bark without crushing it. And then you have this really tender meat on the inside that you need to slice through. If you have a dull knife, you're just gonna mash everything together. So you need something with as little resistance as possible. And these slicing knives have these little divots in them, and this helps reduce the amount of friction and resistance. So these are really nice. You can also get serrated ones that look like this, or serrated bread knives that look like this, and they're really good for cutting brisket. Or if you have an electric knife, get an oversized electric knife and that'll work just fine. Making your brisket slices too thick. So it's usually recommended that you do a 1/4-inch slice on your brisket. That's kind of the perfect amount of food that someone needs. They can always eat more if they want, but if you slice it like 1 inch thick and it's super long, that might be too much meat for a lot of people. So usually it's a 1/4-inch is the standard, especially for barbecue competitions. Not having a big enough cutting board. A brisket is a pretty big cut of meat, and if you're gonna be cooking a lot of them, you wanna get a pretty big cutting board. You can get a cheap one from like a restaurant supply warehouse, and they're just made out of plastic, and they're usually around like 10 to 15 bucks. Or you could spring and pay a lot more money for a big wooden one, but you always want to make sure that you have a big cutting board because you don't want some dinky little cutting board with a huge brisket sort of overfilling all the surface area. It just makes it way too hard to catch all the juices and to cut it properly. Not having a way to capture all the juices as you slice into your brisket. Even if you have a huge cutting board, when you slice into that brisket, you could be getting juices everywhere and they drip and it's annoying. And you also want to save those juices because you can take them and brush them back onto your slices of brisket and serve them as au jus. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll take a big tray and I'll set it down, and then I'll set my cutting board inside of it. So even if the juices drip off, they're all dripping into that tray. Not coating your slices of brisket with drippings. As soon as you slice into a brisket and expose that meat to the air, it's gonna start oxidizing, it's gonna start drying out. So I'll take a slice right down the center of the brisket, and then I'll set it on top of the cutting board so that the meat area is not exposed while I work with the second chunk of brisket. And every time I make a slice, I take my silicone brush and I dip it into the drippings, and then I brush each side of it. Then I put it to the side, I take another slice, and I do the same thing. And what you're doing is you're protecting the surface of the meat with all the fat from those drippings, and you're preventing it from oxidizing and drying out. The second thing this does is it makes your brisket look a lot more juicy, and your guests are gonna be really impressed. Expecting a super juicy brisket. Now, when we look at barbecue pitmaster TV shows and Instagram photos of restaurants that cook awesome briskets, the briskets look so juicy. And the reason they look juicy is because they're using really high quality briskets like Wagyu or prime grade, which have a lot of fat and interconnective tissue in them. And when that fat melts and when that interconnective tissue, the collagen, renders down into gelatin, that's what is producing the visible moisture and tenderness that you can see in the photo. And they also brush the outside of it with its own juices to make it look more tender. But if you have like a select grade brisket or even a choice brisket, it might not have as much of that fat, the interconnective tissues that render down into those things that make a brisket really juicy. You might just be left with a little bit of water that hasn't been squeezed out through the cooking process. So a lot of people will post the pictures of their brisket onto Facebook or Instagram, and they'll say, oh, why is my brisket so dry? It's not really dry. That's what a brisket is supposed to look like. You've cooked it to heck for hours and hours and hours. It's squeezed out all of its moisture. So just be aware that that is completely normal. If your brisket is not as crazy juicy as you see on Instagram or those TV shows, don't worry, that is what a brisket is supposed to look like. Not reheating your brisket correctly. So the correct way to reheat your brisket is the same way you cooked it, low and slow. You want to put it into an aluminum or another baking pan. Cover it tightly in foil so there's as little air left as possible. Make sure there's some extra juices in the brisket. It's not just completely dry. If you need to, add a little bit of extra beef stock, so there's a couple millimeters on the bottom with some liquid, and then put it in your oven at 200 degrees Fahrenheit, super, super low. And you're gonna reheat it for 4 to 5 hours until it comes up to 165 degrees Fahrenheit. Then you can pull it out and it's gonna be super juicy. It's not gonna be dry. Searing your brisket before smoking it. So I look at a lot of recipes on the internet and some of them call for searing your brisket before you start smoking it. That's not really a good idea if you wanna go for that traditional Texas style crusty bark on the outside, because it's gonna ruin the meat's ability to form that nice bark. So if you want to try it out, go for it, but if you want traditional Texas style crunchy bark, then I wouldn't recommend it. Cooking your brisket the same day you want to eat it. So a lot of people think that they need to get up at 2 a.m. in the morning and smoke their brisket for like 20 hours and then it's going to be done for dinner. You don't have to kill yourself doing that. You can wake up at a reasonable time on the weekend. Sometimes I wake up at 9 or 10 and then I throw my brisket on, and then I just cook it throughout the day. I have dinner, like I'll order a pizza or something for Saturday night, and then my brisket will finish around like 9 or 10 at night. I'm still up at that point and I can do everything I need to do to make sure it probes tender and rest it properly. I put it in the fridge, and then the next day, about 5 hours before dinner, I preheated it in the oven at 200 degrees Fahrenheit. It turns out just as good as it would if it just came off the smoker and it was fresh. So don't think that you need to kill yourself and wake up super early or do like an all-night smoke if you want to smoke a brisket. There are other ways around it to do it within a normal lifestyle. Number 100, we finally made it here, and you'll notice that my beard is a little bit longer. That's because I'm filming this about 3 weeks after I did all of the rest of the footage. I just realized when I was editing the video that I forgot one of them. Barbecue Jesus, forgive me, I'm so sorry. The final mistake is overloading your smoker with too many briskets. If you're cooking multiple briskets, keep in mind, on an offset smoker, if you have a brisket that is closer to the firebox side than the one on the cold side, that brisket is gonna cook a lot faster because it's exposed to a lot more heat. So make sure you're rotating those briskets frequently. If you have a pellet grill, make sure you're not overloading it with briskets, moving the brisket too close to the edge. That could cause the fat from the brisket to drip down onto the fire pot, and you could get a grease fire in extreme circumstances. So you always want to make sure that all those drippings are being caught by the deflector plate. And if you have an electric smoker, don't overload it with briskets because it's going to create a lot of steam and you're not going to get really good bark because there's a ton more moisture when you add a second brisket into that electric smoker than if you just have a single brisket. The biggest challenge to overcome when cooking multiple briskets in the same smoker is you have more moisture, you have more thermal mass to heat up, so it's going to take longer. There's going to be more moisture. So give yourself more time, and you might not need something like a water pan. You might not need to spritz it so often because you're already gonna have a really humid, moist environment with all of those briskets in your smoker. All right, guys, those are 100 brisket mistakes. The last thing I wanted to do before we wrap this up is show you the results of our sacrificial brisket. Now, I made a lot of the mistakes I talked about on this brisket during the cooking process. I wrote them all down here. So first, I got a select brisket. A select brisket doesn't have as much fat content. It doesn't turn out as juicy as a choice grade brisket or a prime grade brisket. So that was the first mistake I made. I brined it overnight in a saltwater solution. So I'm interested to see how this is gonna taste. I scored the fat cap, so a lot of the moisture was allowed to escape, and it just looks kind of weird. I didn't trim the fat to a 1/4 inch thickness, so we've got this huge chunk of fat on the outside that is like an inch thick that nobody is ever gonna eat. I cooked it fat side up on the Traeger, so the opposite side from where the heat is going, so I suspect that the bottom is gonna be a little bit burnt. Too high a temperature on the Traeger, so too high a temperature for the cooker I was using. I was cooking this at 275. Bad drainage, so I had issues because I didn't put a pop can or a chunk of wood under here, and the water started to pool on the brisket, and the bark didn't really form that well on that one area because of that. I didn't add liquid when I wrapped it. Bad wrap job. I did a really terrible wrap job with aluminum foil. There was like a big hole in the aluminum foil where all the steam could escape. And when I opened this thing up, it had very little liquid left on the bottom of the foil, which is not a great sign. And the final mistake is I didn't let this thing rest. Now, obviously it's resting right now as I'm talking to you. So it's probably rested about 15 minutes. Usually I would let it rest for an hour or two until it comes down to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. This thing is 198 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm gonna cut into this thing right now and we're gonna see how it turns out. All right, so here's my landmark cut. So I know that the grain is running this way. So I am going to make a cut right in the middle of the brisket. Luckily I have a really sharp knife. Let's take a look at it. You can see all the steam escaping, and that's because there's a lot of heat still left in this brisket. You can see all the moisture is now sort of drizzling out of it. It's getting squeezed out now that this is cut open. Nice smoke ring, which is great. You can see where this fat is, that the smoke ring did not go far enough through to get to the actual meat because this huge chunk of fat was blocking the smoke ring from going all the way through. So those gases that I was talking about earlier that interact with the myoglobin and create that chemical reaction that creates that pink, they only probably made it about halfway through this big chunk of fat. It would have needed a lot longer to actually reach that meat part. So that's what happens when you have an interrupted piece of the brisket that has a huge chunk of fat. This is probably the perfect amount of fat. The gases were able to get through that fat and do the chemical reaction magic with the outside of this meat and make a beautiful smoke ring. Now let's put this to the side. It's still really hot. And I'm going to take a slice from this part of the point. And we got the point muscle up here, and then we got the flat underneath it. So I'm just gonna take a really thin slice. So let's take a look at this. And this is almost too hot to handle, but I'll take this part of, wow. So this is the point here. You can see it pulls apart pretty nicely. So that's pretty well cooked, that point muscle. But if we take a look at the flat, so just for science sake, I am going to cut off the point. Just get rid of that so we can take a look at the flat. So here we're left with the flat, and I'm going to take a cut of this guy. So first of all, if you look at the bottom, look at that burning. You can see on the very bottom of the brisket, it's really hard and crispy, and it's not very nice. And that is because we had that non-fat cap side facing the heat source on the Traeger. And that is what happens when you do that. And if you take a look at the bottom of the flat, you can see that it's really burnt. So it got really crispy because it was exposed to too much of that direct heat. So that is why, let me just give it a tap with a knife here. See, that is really hard. We do not want a brisket to turn out like that, but that is what will happen if you don't smoke with the fat side down in a pellet smoker, and if you smoke at too high a temperature on a pellet smoker. So let's take a bite of this. First of all, let's do a pull test. It pulls apart actually really easily. So this thing probably is a little bit on the overcooked side, I would say. So we'll pull that apart and we'll take a bite of this. So what would I say about this brisket? It's too salty. I think the brining really added way too much salt, and then we added salt afterwards in the dry rub. So way too salty. The fat cap is way too big. I should have trimmed off way more fat. So there's big chunks of fat that nobody is going to eat. The bottom of the brisket, on the flat side of the brisket, is really crispy. It got burnt because we were cooking it at too high a temperature with the fat side up on the Traeger, and that'll happen on any pellet smoker. And it didn't retain a lot of moisture because we didn't add any liquid back in when we did the wrap. We probably cooked it a little bit too long, so it didn't retain a lot of moisture, and we also didn't rest it, so it didn't have chance to suck up a lot of that moisture. So it is really dry. But you add a little bit of barbecue sauce to that, you put it in a chili or something, you can make tacos with it. It would still be pretty good. So I'm kind of surprised how well this turned out, despite all the things I intentionally did to try to screw it up. Now, if you guys are looking for the proper way to smoke a brisket and not commit any of these mistakes, then check out this video where I'll walk you through the process step by step. See you in the next video.